Hi and welcome to Huripek Talks. My name is Sylvie Namwase from the School of Law at Makerere University. I'm also a postdoctorate researcher at the school's Human Rights and Peace Center. Huripek Talks is a podcast hosted here at Huripek in the School of Law at Makerere University in Uganda. It is a platform where we explore topics at the intersection of law, peace and policies, and politics as they affect Uganda, Africa, and the world. In our first podcast series, we are going to explore the question of militarism and militarization. The return of coup d'etats in West Africa has once again pushed militarism to the forefront of Africa's politics, and here in Uganda, the discourse around the role of armies in the country's social, political, and economic landscape is gaining momentum. But as you will soon discover in this episode, militarism is not new to our collective memory as a country. And to start off this series, we ask ourselves where this phenomena of militarism and militarization comes from and how it has come to define who we are as Ugandans. The first episode of this series is entitled DNA Testing. In the case of militarization of Uganda, who is the father? This is a bit of a playful banter that we've been having in the country around the question of DNA and paternity tests. And perhaps also, as you will soon discover along the way, the patriarchal nature of militarism and militarization itself makes it, I think, in my opinion, rather fitting that the title of this first episode should actually be framed within the lens of patriarchy. DNA testing, who is the father? Where does militarization and militarism come from in the ways in which we are experiencing it today in Uganda? And here to explore this topic with me today is the distinguished Mr. James Nkubi, who is soon to become a Doctor of Laws. James is currently a PhD student and a researcher on a joint project between the Center for Resolution of International Conflicts, which is based at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and Huripek here at Makerere University. He practices constitutional and human rights law and democratization in Africa through teaching, research, writing, and activism, with a particular focus on security sector reform, citizens' resistance, and liberative politics in Africa. He currently directs programs at Kituo cha Katiba, which is an East African Center for Constitutional Development, and also functions as a regional think tank that monitors, researches, and engages generally in discourse on constitutional law developments within East Africa. James, you are most welcome.
Thank you, Sylvie, for having me and for the mouthful humble CV.
Yes.
I'm glad to be part of this very important discussion going on.
Yes, indeed. And so James and I have actually also been working together a lot and thinking a lot about these issues because, as I already introduced myself, I have also been a postdoctorate researcher on this project, which is actually still ongoing, but soon to finish. As you've heard, James is also soon to get his own PhD. Before we go on to the actual episode, I just want to remind you, our dear listeners, that if you're interested in research and discussions about human rights, law, and peace in Uganda and East Africa broadly, then Huripek Talks is the place for you to be. This is a show that is hosted by Makerere University in Uganda, and it features experts and opinion leaders on these subjects. So you should remember to subscribe, like, and turn on your notifications in order to stay in the loop with our latest research and discussions. And now on to the episode. James, you've been thinking and writing, we've been thinking and writing about this topic of militarism and militarization. And for yourself on your PhD journey in particular, you've been doing this for close to 4 years now. What have you found is emerging generally around this subject? Specifically, what is militarization, and does it have any connection with militarism?
Thank you, and I'm glad that we sharing thoughts. Nothing is cast in stone, but I think when it comes to the dichotomy between militarization and militarism, of course, some scholars see no difference, and sometimes the word is used interchangeably. But there is convergence of thought that from the different people or scholars who have taken on this matter. And I think it's important to also understand that I've come to discover that the scholarly background of someone will always have a bias on how the person chooses to define this militarization. But at least there is, in all of that sea of definitions, there are particular denominators that we can't miss. And one of them is that militarization is a process. And the fact that it is a process, it is important for us to know that it must end somewhere. And being a process, I personally was interested in demilitarization. It means that process can be halted, and if potentially it can also be reversed. But the fact that it is a process speaks volumes in relation to how it ends, if it ends. So there is that denominator, that this is a process. A process of what? Again, there's another denominator where all scholars agree, that it's a process where you see societies taking on military values. Societies taking on, by societies I mean civilian societies. Or you see the military becoming dominant. Its values, its ethos, its ideas, its, basic, issues like dressing, language, terminologies. In Uganda here we have a media house which calls itself a command center.
Yes.
Okay, a command center. And when you dig deep, these semblances of we're in charge, we're in command. So it goes to the fabric, to the social fabric of a country like ours here. And before you know it, you begin seeing some sort of what I call a mutation. People begin to mutate, and they can even become more military than the military.
True.
Okay?
Yes.
This process can be so effective that it can create citizens that champions of what some scholars call mind militarism. Mm-hmm. It takes over them. They begin to glorify militaristic ideas over those that are civilian. And before you know it, you have civilian leaders who are more militant because the ethos has taken over and supplanted, okay, displaced what would have been the ideal civilian way of doing things or political way of doing things. So in short, this process has capacity to influence the politics, the economics, the social fabric of a country. And when we see these signs I was talking about earlier, then we can begin to connote that there is presence of this process. Mm. When we see increments in budget, when we see increment in military budget, of course, when we see increment in military personnel, when we see soldiers everywhere in spaces that were initially civilian oriented, we can begin to question whether this process is taking root. Conclusively, therefore, it could also be a continuum. Yes. You know, that it goes on building and building until to a time where the military actually now becomes the overall decision maker in a country. I tend to think that militarization can tilt a state or a society to military rule without a coup.
Yes.
You know, even in the presence of constitutions, of elections, you can unconsciously be under military rule. What for me is probably the ultimate end of this continuum, when everyone has been eventually subdued, sieged, and captured into this military ethos and is normalizing it. It becomes normal. In fact, becomes abnormal for you to question it. And that's where now it goes to your other, to the topic, the DNA changes of the citizens. The DNA of how institutions work changes. The DNA of how the captured institutions or even the captured individuals in public service have taken over military ethos changes to become militaristic. Now, when you contrast that with militarism, on the other hand, there is agreement again in the sea of distinctions that militarism is more of an ideology.
Yes.
A thought process, an idea propelling. Okay. So, And then when you put the two terms together, then it becomes obvious that militarization is the actualization of militarism. In essence, this ideology, we begin to see it in action when the process of militarization takes place. Of course, the arguments of interchangeably using them may reign high, but it does not dispel the fact that, they carry almost the same denominators that we see military values being propounded over and above civil values.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
You have put it so well. I myself have actually also been wondering about also any actual judgments that could be made about militarization. Because, you could have, yes, it is a process, but also what about value judgments?
Mm-hmm.
Is all militarization bad? For instance, we know we've had arguments about militarization being fronted as necessary for capacity building.
Yep.
We know countries that have actually been built, the modern concept of a state,
yes,
that have been built off of just through these processes of, militarization. Real huge logistical capabilities, efficiency, discipline, etc. that are being fronted as values that are actually good for state building, even for the economy to grow. And so that presents a bit of a dilemma, because I think, and even you and I can agree on this, the general tendency is to think and to resist, even in the discourse that you might be having with stakeholders in the security sector. And you say to them, militarization, the country is militarizing, and the first instinct is to push away and say, oh, you're accusing us of something bad. I think someone even said that it's an insult to say that the country is militarizing. But yet, to a large extent, also the literature has been talking about it in terms of it being a factor for reversing democratic gains because of the ways in which perhaps it is being used. Yep. So could you comment on that a bit, on value judgments?
Yeah, and like you rightly put it, those who are practicing it will find resistance. They become defensive on this, the fact that you're telling them it's militarization. But I want to also agree with you, and I think this discourse is also emerging among scholars. People like Schotter calls it surplus militarization. Actually insists that a state inherently, and actually humans inherently, for defense purposes, for purposes of, situations of flight, you invoke traits of militancy, he claims. But in terms of institution, he claims that a state for stability, for development, for defense, it must be militaristic, or it should militarize. The debate is more of when you go beyond what is expected. I think for me that's where the lubricant lies. That have you gone beyond what we expect you to be for survival? Has Uganda gone beyond the acceptable militarization phase or ingredients?
Or the necessary militarization.
Yeah, necessary, right? And for me, that's why I normally add a word unchecked militarization to put a disclaimer that where militarization is checked, it can actually be guided to deliver whatever is needed of it. It can be guided to positively deliver development in particular aspects. It can be guided. I use the word guided very mischievously, because we have a guy here who always thinks is a chief guide. But by guiding, I mean guided by what? By the law. Yes. By the supreme law. By rules and regulations that you can't go this far. You cannot, this is what we want of you for this particular period of time. And then we sever relationship. So, for me, the bottom line here is that we cannot entirely say that militarization is negative. But yet we cannot be naive to believe that militarization that is unchecked, that has gone beyond the necessary, can coexist with democratization. They can't be bedfellows. Certainly not.
That's very interesting.
Because democratization prioritizes supremacy of the citizens over government institutions. Militarization is advocating for supremacy of military values or even the military institution over the civilians. There's that subordination quest. And they clash. So the ultimate debate that must happen or balance that we must have is how do we ensure that we do not lose the necessary militarization and we don't go into the terrain of unnecessary, unchecked, dangerous militarization. And once we crack these dichotomies, then the debate of, or the thought that militarization is negative, which is the current denominator in this discourse, can collapse into balancing. How do we balance the positives that can be harnessed therefrom, and how do we counter the negatives? Yes.
And of course that implicates us as the civilians.
Yes.
How are we able to balance?
That
are we able? Because as you may have also found in the literature around civil-military relations, in order for you to have a professional army, you equally need to have a very capable civilian leadership or authority that can effectively check and is competent to check that balance and ensure that balance happens. And the army can also respect that civilian authority. So I think we also have work to do on our side.
Certainly.
Yes.
And that balance cannot come in unless we have built the necessary, sustainable, strong institutions.
Yes.
Only strong, and by strong here, we don't mean militaristic institutions.
Yes.
Because you see, in my findings, Sylvie, there's been a tendency which is being constructed among the citizenry that if the military is in charge, that institution is strong. Strength is equated to the presence of the military. The strength we need in institutions in this country must be gauged differently in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and sustainability.
And accountability.
Yes. Not strong in the ability to coerce.
In the hardware
of
guns
exactly.
and boots.
The ability to dominate. And that mindset is increasingly encroaching on the ideal strong institutions.
Yes.
In the way we know them in terms of building a nation, in terms of building a country. So yes, I agree that the formidability of the institutions you're building, that's the parliament, the judiciary, even civil society.
Yes.
Even an enlightened, like a literate citizen, you know, that tripartite is important. With the least expected citizen being able to question some of the things that are militaristic in nature. So that the quest for balance must be met with a deliberate agenda to build effective, efficient, accountable, sustainable institutions.
Yes.
That can put a pedestal or a pedal or some sort of stop to the military, and the military listens to them. Because ultimately, that's what a state should be like. A functional one where the citizen still remains, the civilian remains supreme over and above these institutions, including the military.
I agree. And it's quite scary what you mentioned earlier about the ideology of militarism permeating the minds of the people, such that you can even end up having people who are more militarist than the military itself.
Yeah.
And it's a phenomena that scholars like Jude Kagoro have also touched on when they explore the concept of soft militarization, where he argues that I think from what I've read, it's a two level playing field. In the first scenario, the military will itself involve increasingly in areas that are more or less cultural aspects of society. So the soft aspects of society, engaging with society, it's more or less PR or also civil military relations.
So like evil on the face of it.
Yes, so like cleaning up the streets, which I think the army does also here in Uganda once in a while. Yes. or even Jude says you find soldiers giving TV programs about relationships, about love, about marriage,
appearing human.
Yes. so there is that angle, and then there is that angle where the citizens themselves begin to, so in the other first angle, the military enters the hearts and minds of the people, and then in the other angle is the citizens absorbing militarist values and then reproducing them by glorifying them in the media themselves. Even, for instance, in the way that they report about the soldiers and in the way they label themselves. So, how dangerous do you think soft militarization is vis-a-vis hard militarization? Where the hard militarization, I would imagine, is more of the hardware, things that we're seeing, boots on the ground, actual guns, money being spent on tankers, etc. In your view, what do you think is more? Well,
first of all, I differ from Jude and his theory of soft and hard. First of all, it's also critical to see that that's a very important step in trying to deconstruct militarization, particularly in Uganda, because we have been very generic in the past, where you just say there is militarization, but a discussion that tries to introduce topologies of that kind must be welcomed. I take it a notch higher in soft, and for me, I term it for now non-structural, where the military comes in, using the very examples that you have hinted on. It comes in, and on the face of it all, it is not doing anything wrong to the naked eyes, right? But when you dig deeper, the harder or the longer or the more consistent soft militarization is, the more perfected the process of militarization can be, because it seemingly comes off as innocent. In fact, you could also relate it to constructing citizens into this belief that if a military man can talk about love, then after all, there's nothing so phenomenally wrong with the militant ideology. And it is cast in a very, very shady format of them saying that we're also human. We can talk about this. I mean, given they are human.
They are human.
Yeah, but they chose to be different humans in this context.
Yes.
They go through different trainings. They go through different ideological orientations. They chose to be a different lot from the humans in quotes. But that is part of the tools that let's deconstruct. And I've seen some scholars actually saying that it is the embodiment of civil and military relations. I think it is the embodiment of the deception riding under civil and military relations, riding under a good terminology, a good necessary process. But when your ultimate hidden agenda is not to establish good relations, but to co-opt civilians into believing that you are the ultimate solver of their problems, that you are above them, okay? That your thought process is more expansive, more robust, because you belong to the military. And for me, this process begins to achieve when you're driving around, the city here, and you find someone who's a civilian having a jacket of a military personnel on the back of his car. Okay? On the seat. Probably as a cousin or something. And then he's putting it there for well-known reasons.
Yes.
That it is a scare off, or it is a show of power. It's a show of connection. That you may see me in plain clothes, but this jacket tells you that I know someone. Now, someone would say, but that's a jacket. Yeah, but it is a jacket that is distorting power relations in society. Someone thinks that if he has an issue, he shouldn't call police. Okay? Why don't they put on jackets of police, for example? Why don't they put on the clothing of a report and, you put on your car? Because or we have been crafted into the belief that actually the police jacket can't serve you. The military jacket can't serve you. You having a phone number of a military general can't save you. So this soft militarization is actually hard. Ultimately, it becomes hard. It builds.
It's an avenue towards the consolidation of,
exactly.
of power.
Such that when tomorrow the military comes up and says, we need this amount of money, we need this amount, we need this kind of budget, you find little resistance within the citizen because they've already been led to believe that actually these people need it, you know? And I think it works so well when you juxtapose it with a very interesting phenomenon of securitization by Professor Ole. You know, when you elevate some of these societal issues and then which would have been settled politically, which would have been settled by technical officers, and then you elevate them to the you know, the level of they having a security connotation to them, you'll find people ceding their space quickly. And they say, no, this one now belongs to the military. After all, they were there, they were here, they were here. So spaces which were initially not befitting of military encroach, become actually the top or the destination for the military, because all now the military needs to do is to securitize them a bit.
Yes.
And the already softened people, the softened citizenry, will not be able to resist, you know, because it has already been co-opted. And I think it's a very dangerous, this soft militarization is one of the most dangerous, but the most convenient and innocent ways that this country is being taken to that route.
And one of the most effective, I would say then.
Yes.
But then, so what is the genesis of this? Has Uganda always had militarism or militarization? Can you tell us a bit more about what you've found about the history of militarization in Uganda?
Yeah, and briefly, when you look at, if you to interrogate militarization in Uganda historically, you need to categorize it into almost 4 parts, or 5. And the first one is, you know, the era, because of our history, we normally call it the pre-colonial, because the word colonial is a factor. The pre-colonial era where we were almost nameless as a country, but we could classify us in terms of a people. And therefore, for you to appreciate the militarization history of Uganda, there's always that first part of the people that were inhabitants of Uganda before it became a name. Now, you also need to dig deeper into how these people were, the formations of these people. And these were kingdoms, right? Now, findings reveal that Ugandans or Ugandan people, or people who occupied the space called Uganda, were always militaristic, both in thought and then, more interestingly, in culture, in the values and norms that organized their communities. And if you take 2 particular examples, actually 3, the kingdoms at the time, for example, Buganda Kingdom, Bunyoro Kingdom, you could even go in Acholi Kingdom or the Acholi Chiefdom. You'll see that this is now where almost the central organizing or entities upon which the communities were organized, you know, the kingdoms. You'll discover that even just becoming a leader at the time, being a chief at the time, being a king at the time, you had to possess peculiar military skills. Or if not possess them, claim or pretend to possess them. You know, why would you do that? Because the people already knew that they needed someone who can defend them. The people wanted or needed someone who they would follow when he exhibits peculiar values or peculiar aspects of attributes, even physique, that were over and above what for them they had. So you'll find manifestations of militarization then encroaching into even the names kids were named. Okay? In Buganda here, it encroached even to gods. For example, in Buganda, there was I don't know if it exists now. I should ask some of these gods. There existed a Mukasa.
Yes.
You know, someone called a god called Mukasa.
The god of war?
The god of war.
Yes.
And he would be consulted And the mediums through which he or she, we don't know.
Mukasa would be a he.
We have to ascertain that.
I think Mukasa would be a he.
Yeah. So the mediums through which he spoke, whenever they gave their word that attack, that was final. The commanders at the time of the Uganda royals would have no reason to backtrack. In fact, they would go very sure that they were going to win that war. And it was an abomination to resist the word of the God of war. So we see militarization permeating into belief systems, the highest really nature of beliefs, that level of gods. But also we see it being a very key determinant of succession wars, where kings, for example, in Bunyoro, kings had to, princesses had to fight each other to see who emerges the best militarily.
Princes.
Yes. In case of the death of a king. Selection was based on that. Who is better in terms of military acumen? Who is better in terms of military formation, strategy, and actual battle on ground? And then by way of that, it became a determinant of who would become the next king. Okay? Now, it permeated so much even into the values of chiefs. For you to be appointed a chief by the king, you had to have capability to raise an army in case you needed to. In fact, a time came in Uganda towards the 18th century where chiefs also had their own private armies that were on call to aid the kingdom in case of anything.
And also in expansion, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah. In expansion as well. And you could see that the entire spectrum of formation, of strengthening of these kingdoms, or these societies for that matter, were based on these military values. But now the catch was very interesting, was the justification question. We see in the pre-colonial era, these societies were militaristic or militant for a reason. And some of these reasons were justifiable. One, as they became exposed to the outside world with the coming in of the Arabs, coming in of the Europeans, the threats of takeover of their kingdoms became imminent. And militarization became a natural choice that you must, for me, I call it survival-oriented militarization. You must militarize to survive because an enemy is beckoning.
Yeah, and the enemy is an existential threat.
Exactly.
Yes.
And is extremely powerful because they came with guns, powder guns. They came with this advanced technology because at that time we were dealing with bows and arrows and so forth. Spears, But even then, in those, there were upgrades. You could see Uganda, for example, upgrading in terms of what kind of spear they took on, the short spears, the shield. They even changed formations. A time came when Uganda had over 2,000. It had the best force on what you could call the maritime in this context.
Yes.
The navy, actually.
Yes.
The base with over 2,000 canoes.
Yes.
Yes. And this kind of expansive build-up can connote current day, human personal increment in terms of militarization. So we see all of this permeating. The difference which we have been seeing in time has always been the justifications. But also there's an underlying denominator there that the more these societies began being exposed to the outside world, the more militarized they became. Not only from the existential threat that came, but also the colonialists came with guns as gifts. Okay? And now they changed the entire terrain of how armies formed and so forth. Now, when you bring it to the colonial period, now the colonialist has come, he also needed to militarize because he was conquering.
Yes.
The conquered societies needed to militarize to fight back. And now we had a standoff. Okay? Where you have overly powerful colonial forces coming in. And then you have the rise of the likes of Kabalega, the rise of Mwanga, fighting liberation wars, militarizing in form of guerrilla warfare. Mwanga and Kabalega almost put on a resistance of 27 years of guerrilla warfare. We're talking about 27 years of militarizing a society. Because now we're talking of spies, You're talking of military emissaries. You're talking of supplies. You're talking of an entire reordering of society that has now gone into full combat of guerrilla movement, of guerrilla warfare, taking on an enemy who's equally, Captain Lugard, equally militaristic, the Colvilles and so forth. In fact, when you look at the glaring evidence of militarization in Uganda, which began in the colonial time, is the current day streets in this country. Streets in Uganda. When you do a circle of Kampala, you will discover that almost the most powerful 7 streets are named after military generals, the colonialists. Captain Lugard, Colville Street. These were military fellows. And that remains incarnated in our history. Okay? Who came to take on the indigenous African. Now, and you could see that the colonialists perpetuated it using agreements. And their agreements were very interesting. They would demilitarize the local chiefs and the local kings and militarize themselves.
Yes.
In essence, it became...
Or militarize their agents.
Exactly.
Yes.
In essence, it became a problem for a king to have more than 2 guns unless he's cleared by the governor. Which governor had more than two guns. So the arguments are coming in to demilitarize a society that was militarizing to fight back, to retain their territory. And it is now militarizing the newcomer, the settler, to suppress, to contain, In essence, one would say that it was containment-oriented militarization. Now, we inherit those aspects that came with the British. But also, what maybe before even we leave that time, what was very fascinating in the colonial time is how the entire society of Uganda was militarized during the World War I and II. The entire society of Uganda had to contribute in what you used to call the war fund, to contribute money for the upkeep of the military, the British, while they were fighting. There's what we used to call the war loans, when people used to bring monies. And these monies are recorded from Bukedi, from Busoga. They would bring as an entity, as a people. They collect money. They give it to the governor transmits it to the colonial office.
Interesting.
So you could see the permeation of military. In fact, one scholar notes that the survival of the military of the British became a very big priority of a local citizen. By way of how it was, you're seeing the change of the ethos.
So, but
now.
Was this soft militarization, or was there and was it also consensual, or in terms of agency, or was there elements of coercion? Seeing as we were in a colonial context.
Interestingly, it was there's no indicator of coercion. If it is there, then it was manipulative. But you could see people sourcing this money, the chief sourcing this money, collecting it, and then they hand it over. And then what was very interesting is that the governor would write back to the people, purportedly, transmitting a letter from the Queen, saying the Queen received your help and is astounded at how you're standing with Britain at this moment of trial. I mean, some of the terminologies are very fascinating.
So it was clearly manipulation.
Exactly.
Yes.
So now when we move to the level of the post now colonial, when Uganda gets independence, particularly 1962 to 1969, this is where you get very interesting civilians who are more militaristic than the military. In particular here, President Obote. And I think there are 2 very important years that can't be missed, which changed the trajectory of this country in terms of militarization. And that is 1964, when we had the first mutiny of the now Ugandan army, which had been inherited from post-independence. The mutiny, which was largely a decisive factor because of how the government reacted to it. Meanwhile, there was a mutiny in Uganda, there was a mutiny in Kenya, there was a mutiny in Tanzania. In Kenya and Tanzania, the civilian government put a stop to it. And it was emphatic. It made changes in the military. It put them in their place. It told them, you are nothing but people who must be subordinate to us. So the 2 militaries of Kenya and Tanzania have grown with that narrative, knowing that they are not above the civilian.
With that guidance.
Yes, with that guidance. In Uganda, we did a different thing. We, first of all, bowed down to everything they said. Their money was increased in terms of wages, allowances. There was an acceleration of ranks, because remember that was a period of Africanization of African militaries, removing the white faces, if you wish. So they accelerated their ranks. There was no one prosecuted. In Tanzania and Kenya, there were prosecutions. In Uganda, no one was prosecuted. The military came to think of itself as indispensable. And this explains the high-level belief in their infallibility and invisibility as key players in the politics of the country. And then we don't forget shock when in 1966, another defining milestone, when the military now eventually is brought into the politics now nakedly by President Obote. And for me, I argue that since 1966, the military has never gone back to the barracks. We have only been seeing semblances, measured returns to the barracks. But it has not gone back. And after 1995, it now even left. It's now on the streets. It's now everywhere. But we can trace this original scene in 64 and 69. And of course, when you come to 71 to 79, it's purely military rule under President Amin, guided by the decrees. When we come to 1980 to 1995, when we have the new constitution, it is a warlord country. We have the Uganda National Liberation Army, a collection of armies of people who were fighting Amin. But we should not lose, Slavy, the very critical aspect of how foreign actors also contributed to the militarization of Uganda, particularly Tanzania, with all its shenanigans, that were very militaristic in nature between 1980 and 1986, where military army would install practically presidents in this country.
Indeed.
And keep them in power. So there is that. Uganda's history has had a very, very difficult to separate relationship with the foreign armies of foreign states, Israel, Russia, Libya, and South Africa as well. And then, of course, Tanzania. Mozambique, So there's been a very direct relationship, which goes back to the argument of how exposed we were to these militaristic regimes that ultimately influenced us, even in hardware, provision of hardware. And then, of course, lastly, we come up with the 86, the guerrilla warfare, which again turned the entire country into a military, more or less, state, coups after another, in a span of 4 or 5 years, presidents changing after another. In fact, when you relate to the history of Uganda, I have found that either, in all the 9 presidents we have had, either the president was a military ruler,
yes,
or he was backed by the military, both literally and in law. Backed. And whenever the military could cough that he will go, he could leave. This is what happened to Lule. This is what happened to Bina Isa, because the UNLF was in charge in the background, because the military commission was in charge in the background. We have not had a fully-fledged civilian president who cannot relate his power, who cannot trace his authority to the military. Even the current day, one would make that similar argument, that there's a relationship between the current state in power and then, of course, the military. Now we come to 1995, where all of these things are meant to change. We come in 1995 constitution, where we are subordinating the military to civilian rule. There is a departure, albeit in paper, and at the beginning years in practical as well, in practice, where, the military became seemingly subordinate, which for me I term into a period of retreat and camouflage. Because I make an argument that until the right moments did come, we were able to see that actually there had been no departure with the past in terms of militarizing the country. It's just that moments had not presented themselves threatening the rule of the NRA for it to actually re-emerge from what it has always been. And that is carrying a military ethos in all its dealings. So, conclusively, Uganda's history rides and is written and cast in militarization. What has been changing have been the modes, the manifestations, and the justifications, and probably the players. But it is different. It's difficult to separate because one cannot even argue that this was state-building militarization. In fact, we have had state destructive militarization. One would argue, of course, that we are seeing that departure with the NRA in charge, that we have seen more developmental-oriented militarism. That can be debated, but at least what remains as a connecting thread in this cobweb of Uganda's politics, the militarization, militarism, and civilians who are more military, those four aspects have been re-emerging, albeit in different continents.
And you brought it to today. I like the history, and I really now appreciate how far back this phenomena actually goes. And if we were to talk about DNA, then that makes it actually all the more interesting and pertinent. But how is it showing up today now? When you look around empirically, what shape is militarism and militarization taking in the Uganda that we know today?
Well, when you look at the current Ugandan state, you can see manifestations of militarization that are forgivable or that can be explained and justified. It's taking the shape of region, what for me I term regional militarization or sub-regional. We all have to agree that, for example, Acholi sub-region for the past 20 years had to be militarized for purposes of countering the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army. We have to agree that part of Karamoja had to be militarized then to counter the militant cattle rustlers.
What about now?
Now can be a different question. and we can interrogate that. Because then you could see glaring, justifications. Now you are at pains on whether militarization is a convenient conduit for other things, but certainly it being a primary goal of pacification, that narrative is being called into question currently, which wasn't the case a few years back. So, on the context of region, Karamoja, northern Uganda, and some parts of the east, in the corridor that connects to northern to Karamoja, that corridor of cattle, you could say that, we had to militarize for purposes of pacification. Not domination, but pacification. Okay? Returning peace to the region. Then we have also seen regional militarization for dominance. When the state comes in to militarize a region to dominate it. Either because that region has become overly assertive because of its marginalized past, or because it is expressing unease at being bambooed together with others when it is not getting its cut. And I think for me the perfect example here becomes Kasese.
Yes.
I mean, it's very difficult to say that you're militarizing Kasese to pacify it. From who? Okay, from who? Whereas in Karamoja and Acholi, we can know from LRA, from the cattle rustlers, but from who, if not yourself? So we have seen, and this has taken diversities. Militarization of region has taken diversities in the context of why, domination, pacification, and then some parts like Kampala and Wakiso for containment.
Or the central region.
The central region, yes. Massacre. Yes. Containment. Ruwero. Nakasongola. You must militarize the region for containment, because you're not sure. If you don't have a military hover over them, you're not sure what they're capable of. One, because they're the centers of urbanization, and there's a correlation between a restless youth. They are the centers of political activism, because they're situated in the centers of power. So naturally, you may want to coup-proof yourself, okay? Unless you're shocked by militarizing those regions. So for me, that has been the first aspect of it, regional militarization, explained by different motivating factors. But then we have also seen what for me I term sectoral or sphere militarization. And by sectoral here, I'm talking about sectors like agriculture, sectors like efforts of fighting corruption, where we don't see the military taking over ministries. It doesn't take over institutions. It comes and takes over sphere. Okay? It takes over sphere and says, joins with others. But when it becomes more pronounced, for example, the anti-corruption unit of the presidency, it didn't take over the IGG. It didn't take over the police. It joined the sphere of efforts against corruption.
But as a parallel institution.
Exactly. Parallelism.
Yes.
What later on for me I call replicative militarization. You militarize by not taking over an institution, but you create a parallel one. You replicate the same exact work, only this time around, you have military people manning your unit. Like the best example we have is that of the anti-corruption unit. We have a land protection unit within the presidency as well, which also has military personnel. So there's that replication. So we have seen that encroachment on sectors and spheres of what were hitherto civilian spheres of operation.
But usually it is done under the claims that the civilian institutions are corrupt, they are not well managed, they are not doing their job. Because, for instance, I know the antecedents of OWC, for instance, and agriculture. The argument was that the civilian structures under NADS, under the National Agriculture and Advisory sector or services, were not doing their job. That there was corruption, there was diversion of funds, farmers were not being given inputs. All of these arguments, and even on the lake, we're talking about the fisheries protection unit. Same argument that the civilian structures are not performing. This is why we need soldiers who are efficient to come in and put the house in order. What do you say to that?
Well, I find that deceptive. And I have written an article on that. I call it the demonization of public service.
Yes, and it's upcoming in our special issue. You'll check it out on the HIRIPEC website.
Yes. And I precisely confront that argument. And I think that the presidency in particular and the executive here and ministers and even military generals of high-ranking level have very, very deliberately adopted the culture of demonizing public service. Remember that the demonization of public service by the 7th presidency has a history. When he had just come, he didn't believe from the word go that actually public service had the capacity to deliver. And for me, I see him or the establishment wanting, I don't know whether genuinely, wanting to reform a public service, but either feigning ignorance on the how, or deliberately displacing the renowned acceptable mechanisms of reforming public service in preference for militarization.
What are some of those acceptable approaches of reform?
For example, I have argued that if the civilians or the public service, the civilian public service, was not doing well in the NADS, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries, why is it that there is no single attempt by the government to interrogate what was going wrong there deliberately? Not as offshoots of we are here, corruption here and so forth. No. What we have actually, that we are being told to believe are the narratives, snippets of corruption without necessarily a single, inquiry. I mean, the president has launched commissions of inquiry in different issues.
Into land, into corruption
into
in the police.
Yes. Why didn't we see an inquiry into NADS of that magnitude? Because you see, and it was required because we're talking about 85%, if we're to go with the statistics, of people living on agriculture. So if there was going to be any entity that required an inquiry of a magnitude we saw in police and elsewhere, it was that. We don't see it. What we see are small snippet speeches of the presidency and some of the military officers and some of the technocrats in the government decrying the rotten state of NADS. Okay? Decrying the corruption, which for me I call demonization. And you could not expect NADS, which we're using as an example, to fight back. Because how do you fight back? The presidency. And this demonization comes to bear whenever the president was moving out in the field during his barazas, he would call out the NADS officer. And he would ask the people, is he working? And then the people would say in chorus, no. Reminiscent of Barabbas in the biblical stories, for those of people who believe the biblical stories, In essence, we saw kangaroo courts, we saw summary trials of technocrats who are under siege of the president. You are under siege of the civilians who have been indoctrinated to see you as demonic. And now when the time came to introduce the military in these spaces, it would fall quite comfortably on the civilians that we're having a savior. Now, for me, the narrative that these institutions are corrupt without a corresponding evidential process by the executive who appoints them to actually dig deep and find out what modes this corruption is taking and what reforms can we do. For me, it leaves me suspect, of what exactly was the intention. Okay? And it does not correspond with good faith, meaningful mechanisms of reforming public service. Because you can't reform with demonization.
Yes. And also the solution has been mostly unilateral, as you know, as you've already said, unilateral presidential directive.
Yes.
Where if we go back into our discussion around our competence as civilian institutions to checked militarization, then it's not possible if it's being enacted via these unilateral presidential directives without anchoring it into proper structured and formal legal frameworks.
Yes.
That can then be subjected to actual formal legal processes and scrutiny. Yes.
In fact, that's a very interesting point. If indeed it was about reform, we would have seen the military coming in, but under particular terms.
Yes.
Particular frameworks.
That you've come to do this to clean up this institution for this period of time.
Exactly.
Then you leave after it has been cleaned up.
Exactly. And this, what we want you to clean up, we found it in this commission of inquiry.
Yes.
After a long period of inquiring what was wrong with NADS, we discovered the following 4 things. This is how you're going to deal with them. Give us your plan. When you're done, you're going to go. You're going to be co-working with the technicals. So we have not seen that deliberate process of clean and go.
There is no methodology. There are no protocols. Yes.
If you're really good, like you claim to be good, you're efficient and effective, clean and go. In fact, it is an indictment on you who claims to be clean, effective, and efficient to come and you don't rub off that same effectiveness and efficiency on people you've phoned.
Yes, so that
you
can leave and they can stand on their own. Yes.
So the fact that you're here to stay is indicative of potentially an underlying reason as why you came. But not necessarily to create efficiency or to reform. Maybe there's another reason, but if it was reform, you reform and leave. So this overrun of the public service, like I argued earlier, in some of the instances, in manifestations, you find in some instances it is structural. It has gone, the military has taken over the entire setup. Okay, and the best example here we can see is the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the National Identification and Registration Authority, NIRA, the immigration, where all the top officers therein are military. Okay, for me that's what I call structure. When the military goes into policy decision-making spaces and supplants, not that they were empty, supplants the technicals who were there and makes them subordinate to now the military, which is an actual amendment of the constitution. Because the constitution says that the military must be subordinate to the civilian.
Yeah.
Now you move in, you take over, and this structural militarization has also happened in spaces where the military moves in an institution and it discovers that if it goes with the positions in the institution, it will not have enough men therein, or it will not be able to control the spaces it wants. So it creates specifically positions for the military. We saw it in police. Police didn't have a chief of staff because we wanted someone in charge. The military wanted someone to be, who's in charge of that docket, and there was no space. They created it and brought a military officer there. So we have seen structural manifestations where we're seeing supplanting of officers that are technical in nature, civilians, but also we are seeing the death of the public service ethos and replicating it with the military ethos. We are seeing a construction of citizens into believing the earlier discourse I was talking about, that these institutions are now efficient, effective, when actually the issue is that they are strong because they are under military. We have seen this in the passport office. We are seeing this in police. But for me, what worries me, Dr. Slavy, when it comes to manifestations today, is that we are seeing military even in what would have been basic spaces. I can tell you in my findings, military now escorts examinations of primary living examinations. Listeners, in the Ugandan education system,
maybe they're trying to protect them from robbers on the highway.
They say they're protecting them from cheating. That there have been a lot of examination malpractices, and therefore you need to bring in military. For me, that is the lowest of it all. Permeating to the level of primary kids who are mainly between 10 years and 11.
Yes.
Seeing military people,
of course,
delivering examinations.
That has got to be one of the most effective means of soft militarization.
Of course.
Actually.
Because now you're entering a mind of 11th year.
They are already seeing who the actual symbol of authority and efficiency is.
Yeah. And allegedly honesty.
And honesty.
Yeah, because they're saying the police can no longer deliver because they are bad, they're not honest. They connive with the head teachers. We're bringing in the military. So you're beginning the process at way young age because they see these people delivering. There's no, when you look at Kampala now, which is a city of 7 hills, they say, you could see that when you look at every road that leaves Kampala, to join to a main, highway, you can see that the military is in charge. Okay? These were spaces that were initially traffic officers, police officers, they're now being replaced. So in essence, it is becoming an everyday reality that everywhere you look, you see a military officer either in uniform or a civilian who is or believes that he's connected, to a military personnel, and therefore he's also becomes the personification of that personnel. Or you're seeing civilian, clothed military officers. You're seeing them having the right of way. Military cars have right of way. Everyone who has a military car, you have a right of way. In essence, it's a glory. We have reached, for me, a crescendo. What I call the coming Armageddon. Where we are going to see a typical contestation of forces of militarization that have reached heightened levels, contending quite sharply with the forces of democratization and constitutional order, who think and who opine that the military must remain subordinate. And these contestations are emerging in simplistic ways, where some people on the road refuse to go off, to let a military vehicle go. They refuse. Deliberately. And that contestation, for now, is not violent. We don't know what's going to be tomorrow. Okay? Because it is emerging. And because it is emerging, we are seeing youth behaving like military. putting on, ranks.
This is one of the things you've been really passionate about during your research.
And in our coming book on militarization, which is really a question on difficult choices, I argue that we are creating, because we have adopted militarization that is hard, that is violent, we are creating equally a militarized society.
Yes.
And we cannot turn back and say that, why are you militaristic? No, I'm your creation.
Yes.
Because of the way you treat me, because of how I see you, because of how you glorifying people who are military. So I must become like you for acceptance, but I must also become like you to contend with you on an equal measure. Because I am dressed like them, I am dressed like you, I have a rank like you, in quotes. I have followers who call me Kano or Jen or whatever. I'm putting on red. I have the shoes like you. And boom, I'm like you. So there's no difference. So we are constructing an equally militant society. And for me, that has been, is the end game of the negatives of unchecked militarization.
It's very interesting. The impact that it has had on even political organizing.
Yes. Of youth especially.
Yes.
The militancy.
Okay. So as we go towards the conclusion, could you then say that Uganda is a country with a military? Or we have a military that has a country?
That question is a very philosophical, dangerous, sensitive, funny, but extremely sad. Because you see, when we begin asking who has who, to distort the actual acceptable order, it means that we have reached a level where it is now manifest that something is wrong. Unfortunately, I gravitate towards the notion that the military has a country for three reasons. One is economic, budgetary. I believe that he who controls a huge chunk of a budget will always have the country. Because the country will give money to he or she or that entity that is key in the country to run. Now, when you say that much of our money goes in classified expenditure and to the defense, that's a given. That's okay. We have been there before. Now, when you look at the ministries that have been taken over by the military, structurally, by structure I mean the military is also in charge of the finances, and you combine those ministries and the money we give them per year, and you total it up, you will discover that in Uganda, the military is effectively in charge of around 45% of the budget. Effectively. In a combined manner. Okay? Now, when you have military generals controlling 45% of your budget, or even more, as wherever we are going, on that financial aspect of it all, then that 45% can be run in whatever way the military may want to completely capture the country. He who captures your finances, you become a subordinate too. Okay? So for me to justify that sad terminology that the military has the country is, let's look at the finances. Which ministries have what money? Who has taken over those ministries? And you can make a combination of Ministry of Internal Affairs, Agriculture, and the previous defense, which already was enough. Okay? We are going into, when you go into the Ministry of I've said Agriculture, I've said Internal Affairs, when you go into the MDAs, okay, the departments and agencies, you know, the military going into UNRWA to take on the roads. Huge monies there. We're talking about huge monies here, you know.
Or the construction sector.
Construction sector, you know, going there into infrastructure, you know, set up. You will discover that financially the country has been handed over to the military, or the military has the country. Two, I define someone in charge of a country or having a country, if that someone has capacity to harm the country, okay, I tend to gravitate in gauging power not in your capacity to develop, but in your capacity to harm. Okay, because you see, your capacity to harm means you can be destructive, you know. Yeah. And when you look at just that, the fact of who has now currently the capacity to harm a country, stop its constitutional trajectory, turn around how the social fabric has been. And by harming, I'm not talking about necessarily violence, but I'm also talking about reordering society beliefs and values.
Or engineering the society.
Exactly. Right now, you cannot point to any other person, not any other political party, but the military. If you look at a rising militant youth, that is already harming a society. That rising militant youth who thinks politics must be militant, you're hurting a generation of politicians.
But they've been created by militarism.
By the militarism, right? And that permeation to change minds of the young, to begin glorification of violence that is martial. I can say that you've taken over. You have a country because you're now practically dealing with its future. Okay. My third aspect, why I conclude that military has a country, is power brokerage. If a border rider, to survive and contend with his enemies, must have a telephone number of his cousin, or even not even a cousin, but his customer, who is a major. In essence, when you begin putting the military as the broker of power, not the police, not the law, not the judiciary, because ideally the judiciary should have been the power broker, together with the lawyers, together with the law. That tripartite of the three, the law, the lawyers, and the judiciary, power brokers based on the law. Now, we have the military doing power brokerage based on their ability to coerce, to dominate. Okay? So you have a new era of citizens, or a mutating citizen who has been made to believe that for you to get any deal in this country, you need a close contact with the military. Now that is extremely dangerous.
Yes. Because
you're now reordering, again, re-engineering how society should run. And if the lowest of society thinks that it needs the military personnel to survive, then you have the country. So for me, those three aspects, the finances, power brokerage, right? And then the third one of the ethos I talked about. When you have all of those three permeating and coming down your own society, I conclude, actually, I gravitate towards you and I say that that's an Armageddon on the way. The military has a country. It is where I argue in my thesis what I call a militaristic apocalypse that is dawning on Uganda soon if we don't reverse this process.
It's good. It's a good point on which to ask you the next and final question. You started off by saying militarization is a process and it can be reversed. And even right now, you have indicated that there is an apocalypse. And if we don't do something about it, we are finished.
Yep.
Indicating that we can actually do something about it. So, some parting shots on policy recommendations on how you think we can move forward, even within this context of militarization.
Two things quickly. One, I think we need to have a genuine transition of the UPDF. Unfortunately, this discourse on militarization is incomplete without talking about the UPDF.
Of course.
But also it's incomplete without talking about the fact that the UPDF is yet to make a transition from a liberation movement ideology to a national professional military or army whose role is constitutional and it doesn't go beyond that. that mind change is important because it continues, and when you look around Africa, it continues to hamper countries like Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF, same story. It continues to hamper progress in Mozambique, Frelimo, same story. There is a very difficult to explain stagnation in terms of transition for all countries that are being manned by liberation movements that became armies. Okay? So the guerrillas must actually become statesmen. Both in mind and also literally. Okay? Even if they put off their uniform and retire, they must actually effectively retire even in mind. If they're transitioning from a liberation movement. Why am I saying liberation movement? Because you see, the embodiment of militarism, of martial violence, of glorification of the gun, is what defines the liberation movement, which takes on a guerrilla warfare. Now, that ideology must be debunked when you take over leadership and you attain a statesman ideology about building the country
that you wanted in the first place, or you alleged you wanted.
That you wanted.
Yes.
You know? We are not in the era of reclaiming a country. We have passed it. We are in the era of consolidating what you reclaimed. You cannot consolidate it with a militarism ideology unchecked. If you are going to use military to do some work, it goes back to what we were saying. Let's check it. You know? Which brings me much to my second point, the law. You know, because, well, we come from a legal background, we cannot separate the law as a potential reversal tool to the militarization of this country. And I have discovered that there are particular amendments that must happen in a constitution which will go a long way in demilitarizing the country. The most immediate one will be the parliament. We have members of the military in parliament. You know, in essence, it's a parliament with a military. 10 members, high ranking. Okay? The narrative of listening posts can no longer really buy anyone any kind of credence, really. So when you come up and you say you're amending the constitution and removing military from parliament, that's already a progression. I mean, you're progressing towards demilitarization. When you come up and say that section 38 of the UPDF Act, which allows for attachment of military officers to other civilian entities should be retained, retain it by as well enacting the necessary regulations there under. How should URA behave when it has an attached military officer? What is the power of that military officer? What are his limitations? To whom does he answer? When is he leaving? Where is accountability in case there are breaches? These checks and balances are key if we are saying we may need the military in some aspects. We are not anti-military in development. Yeah. Okay? We are pro-measured military or checked military in development. Checked by what? By the law. Okay? So again, we need to go back and see, and I make some proposals, particularly when it comes to amendments. That proposal is on the law. And then my other proposal, which I've just told you about, or ending part, is the reformation or transformation of the mind of the ideology of the UPDF, which currently seems to be locked up into a liberation movement ideology to a national army. So in essence, we're confronting the mind and the law. Yes. Because you see, if we bring the law when we have not confronted the mind, there could be a problem.
So there's psychology and the social cultural issues and legal issues.
Exactly. Especially of the institution.
Yes.
Will definitely change its ways. It will change the way it sees itself as invincible and infallible. That glorification. It will know that we're here for a short time and we must metamorphose. We're here to help. But also they should know that they introduced one of the late astute colonels of this country was actually died a brigadier, Colonel Nombo Mayombo. At one time I was asked, what's the future? What was the role of the NRA? What did they come to do? What they are here for how long? And he said, and it's a very interesting way to end this podcast, he said, we as NRA, we did not introduce democracy. We introduced a democratization process that must go on even when we are long gone. He said process.
Interesting.
He said process. And he said that some of us, the military in its own nature may have a role to play, but it can't finish this process. It can't. So what we have done is to introduce this process. People should come. Everyone should build on as we go on disembarking.
Well, that's a vision that has interestingly disappeared.
Unfortunately.
From the narrative we're seeing today.
It's nowhere. It's nowhere.
In fact, in some of our engagement, there seems to be a complete opposition that's being set up between, militarization and democracy. And, democracy or human rights' ability to deliver development versus military's ability to deliver development. It's like they're being set up as opposites of each other.
That's why I call it the Armageddon. The Armageddon that is coming, that clash.
Let's really hope you're wrong, James. But on that note, I also want to recognize our role then.
Yeah.
Our role as civilians.
Yeah.
And
potential as academics as well.
And as academics,
especially
for sure.
Europe,
But also as Ugandans, as citizens.
First.
To I don't know, maybe build our own capacity and engage with these issues more deliberately, on a more intentional, as opposed to a generic way, like you mentioned earlier, how in the past militarization was mentioned generically, but actually it is a thing. Which, if you say it's an Armageddon, we need to actually put it on the table, dissect it, understand it, its intricacies, its complexities, and engage with it with the complexity that it deserves.
Yes.
So not to just sweep it all under the rug as an evil thing. Yes. Okay, fine. We're not saying that you're evil. We're not saying that the military is evil. We're not saying the UPDF is evil. We are saying there is a complexity that is emerging and that has dire implications for the country's democratic, economic, social, cultural landscape. And we need to sit together and address the issues historically
and going by the
through
podcast
time
name today,
and currently.
We need a new DNA.
We need a new, exactly.
And you know who's supposed to birth that new militarization?
Who?
The citizen.
Yes. So that in the future we are talking about demilitarization. DNA. Who is the mother? So we'll change it from a patriarchal standpoint to a more feminist approach, more egalitarian approaches,
rebirth and mothered by citizens,
more democratic approaches
on their terms,
more inclusive, by the citizens, bottom-up approaches, really democratic ethos.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, James.
You're welcome.
And with that, ladies and gentlemen, our dear listeners, we have come to the end of our episode on DNA testing in the case of militarization of Uganda. Who is the father? This was our first episode, and we would like to give special thanks, convey our very special thanks to the distinguished Mr. James Nkubi for being our honored guest today. We are very sure that he's going to pass his PhD. I think this was a mini preparation for your
mini defense.
For your defense. So, and you've done very well. So, and I've passed you. So,
thank
you. The others that come after me must pass you by consequence. So, for our listeners, we hope that the conversation has improved your understanding of the relationship between militarization and militarism, and how it came to be within the Ugandan context, and how it is continuing to manifest within our politics, our society, and our cultures, and what we have to do as Ugandans, perhaps to start to think about how to reverse and deal with this phenomena, because as you've heard from our guest today, it's an Armageddon that will sweep us away if we don't do something. So we invite you to continue sharing and engaging with us on the rest of our episodes. Share them with your friends and networks. Be sure to join us again on the following episodes as we explore further details about this very interesting topic of militarization in Uganda and beyond. And from us and everybody here at Huripec Talks, goodbye.